Hello, everybody. This is NGO Soul+Strategy, and this is Tosca. We have a special episode today. I'm really looking forward to this. Let me ask you some questions. These questions are relevant for some of us, not yet so relevant to all of us. But the question is, what is life after leadership like? What happens with you as a person when you leave a high-powered, highly visible role in civil society? What happens with your sense of identity? What kinds of letting go are involved in that? What kinds of shifts in what gives you purpose and drive and what gives you pleasure have to happen then? How much does this have to do with identity and perhaps with ego as well? That's the purpose of this episode, and it's something that I myself in my own life am also starting to think about. Today, I am interviewing Sam Worthington, former president and CEO of InterAction. We'll explain in a moment. He will what InterAction is. And Sam and I go back a way. We knew each other when he was the InterAction president, as I just said, and I was just one of the many InterAction member representatives. He spoke to our students at Syracuse University when I was still a pre-academic, and he was a contributor to an early version of the Leadership Institute that I used to lead. Later, I was lucky enough to be elected to InterAction's board, so I observed Sam's leadership that way. Sam stepped down in late 2022, and now, almost a year later, it is the perfect time to ask him to reflect on what's life after leadership like. And I want to frame our conversation a little bit based on a recent article in The Atlantic here in the US, an American magazine by David Brooks. He's a well-known journalist and pundit. And his article that is called The New Old Age, and I'm now quoting, "In the 21st century, another new phase is developing between the career phase and I cannot pronounce this word well, senescence." I hope I did it okay. People are living longer lives. If you're 60 right now, you have a roughly 50% chance of reaching 90. In other words, you can expect to have another 20 years before your mind and body begin their steepest decline. It is this recognition of loss that is something that some people experience. And so questions like, who am I? What's my purpose? What do I really want? Do I matter? Are perhaps becoming relevant once again in a new way. That, again, is the focus of this interview. And with that long intro, welcome, Sam.
Welcome, Tosca. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
I am so looking forward to this conversation. So, quick bio. As I said, Sam was the president and CEO of InterAction, and he'll be telling us in a moment what InterAction is. For those of us, again, we have a global audience who do not know about InterAction. Before that, he was also the president and CEO of Plan International USA, and he was an executive director at the Delphi Institute at World Learning, which is a US NGO. So, Sam, let's go. Let's start with recapping. What is InterAction for the maybe not too many, but still who don't know what it is? And what was the role you played there for about 16 years?
So the U.S. international nonprofit sector, so the U.S. NGO sector that works around the world, developed about 40 years ago an apex organization, which is the place where it does its policy thinking, where it does its advocacy, its learning, its attempt to influence the U.S. government and the UN. And InterAction serves that purpose. And I was, in essence, its executive. In that role, I represented in a formal way the U.S. NGO sector at the highest levels of the UN, White House, other places. But also in that role, I was able to create a safe place for executives to reflect on what it means to lead, on how to tackle these complex, difficult jobs, and recognize that you're not alone in doing this, but that you have peers going through very similar things. So it was an apex visible role that I had a great pleasure doing for some 16 years.
Yes, and a very visible role, not just vis-a-vis members of InterAction, but not just the US government, but governments all over the world, international governing bodies, right? You were very visible globally, isn't it?
Yes, and in some ways you're carrying this interesting mantle of you become the voice of a sector. No one could be the voice of a sector, but you become, since we need leaders to play these roles and to step in a room, and sometimes there's only one civil society entity in the room. I would joke at times I need my little InterAction flag because everyone else has a flag around the table in this room. But it was an opportunity to serve a broader community, and try to hold it together during difficult times. And particularly since it's a community where a lot of the pressures on individual executives and organizations are their own well-being, their own resources. And yet there are times when you need to step back and go, well, what is the collective here? What is the role of the collective NGO sector? So I think there's a deep accountability that comes for the role. InterAction's members manage some $15 billion a year, which 3/4 come from private resources. So you're in essence a pool of resources that make this community a large donor at a time of shifting power and different dynamics around the world. So in that capacity, I was both, sort of a leader, but I also viewed myself as a subset of broader global civil society. I would be the American here, but just one part of global civil society representing not a country, but a subset of US civil society very interested in what happens in the world.
That's right. So in short, you were a big deal, right? And so now I would like our conversation to be really focusing on your kind of personal state of mind from around the time you left till now, about a year later, and what happened with your, as I said before, your identity and your sense of self since you left. So let's go back to that, let's say the last part of 2022, when you were getting ready to leave InterAction and to leave this position of clearly positional power, if you will, to join or to start your next phase in life. So what happened with you from a mental and psychological perspective? Are you able and willing to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure.
It's not a small thing.
Not a small thing at all. And I was fortunate in some ways and frustrated in others. I mean, I was fortunate in the sense that I knew a year beforehand that I was leaving. So it wasn't, I had a chance to sort of slowly disengage on all sorts of fronts. So it was like, no, someone else should take this high-level meeting at the White House or whatever the meeting is or what the activity was. I had an opportunity to sort of constantly let go. So that process of letting go, I viewed as something that I started way before I ended that sort of period of a sort of ending of it. So I think that was healthy in the sense. I don't know if there's anything as such thing as a smooth transition in a sense. My challenge here was I wasn't a founder because InterAction had lots of success before I did, but 16 years is long enough so that everything there is your mistake or your creation. And so you have this sort of attachment having created something. And the process of letting go happened rather rapidly with all of a sudden was like, we don't want you making any executive decisions. It's like, I'm still around for 2 months. Really? Okay. I'll let go of that. So there was this process of letting go that accelerated rapidly. So there's an initial reaction is actually one of thank God, that is off my shoulders. The plane did not crash while I was there. It's finally not my responsibility. So there was sort of this breath of fresh air, and we went and spent time in the mountains for our family and just decompressed and just completely let go of that. Yeah. And then you come back and, my wife went back to her job and there is no job. There's sort of a quiet period. And so how did I feel that? So in one level, it was, what was interesting, and sort of when I reflect on this, missing the power was not something I felt. I sort of at a
Can you
stage of
talk more
life.
about that?
I I was fortunate, well, fortunate, whatever, unfortunate, whatever.
Hmm.
In my 30s, I become a CEO. I've been was an executive for 29 years, an enormous amount of time
That's
in that
long.
role. And it's not that you get tired of it, you just don't, there isn't a desire to prove oneself at a certain point.
Mm.
You're not interested in ego. I need to be in the Washington Post, or whatever it is. That is not a driver. It's
Mm.
more, are there things that I care about, and how do I get those off the ground? And will those things last longer than I'm around? And how do they, how will that? So do you leave a legacy, in essence, of some meaningful thing? Will this community be in a different space after I'm gone for a long time because of the role I played? So there is a legacy dimension that definitely plays in there, but it's not I'm the center of the room. I'm inherently a rather shy person, just by nature. I'm sort of an introvert. And I've trained myself. I could certainly talk in front of 500 people, but that's not my comfort zone. I'd rather be
Mm.
out in the woods. And so that that loss wasn't something I felt. What I felt, and what was sort of the acute loss, was I'd spent my entire working life surrounded by people and their minds and their ideas and so forth, as peers, colleagues, and so forth,
Yeah.
as sort of a camaraderie of people around you, whether you
Yep.
agreed with them or not, is
Right.
then gone. So
Yeah.
there's this loss of it's almost like you've you've been the village chief, and you're now asked to no longer be in the village, and
Mm.
you're all of a sudden not part of that village. And I had made a conscious decision, based on some very good advice I'd received, that for at least 6 months, that it was my job not to engage with that village at all, that I had to disconnect myself for my sake and its sake.
So you did that fairly drastically, based also on the advice you got.
I I didn't reach out to any CEOs. I didn't have lunches. Uh, the organization ended up having a difficult transition where the person who replaced me ended up leaving within 5 months. I didn't interfere. I didn't engage. I didn't. I purposefully disconnected, even though sometimes I was asked, Sam, can you do something about X, Y, or Z? I viewed it as it's unhealthy for me to actually step in any way whatsoever.
Okay, so
Um,
also you and your successor had a compact with each other that you would drastically step back and not in any way
it was a compact with
play a
myself,
role.
not with my successor,
Okay.
because they were engaged with the organization, the board, and they left in about 5 months. And so my compact was that no matter what staff say, or external government people say, or whatever is said by anyone, it is not my role to engage in that process,
Yeah.
whether it's positive or not positive in that mix.
Right.
And then once I hit 6 months, all of a sudden the organization is in a new transition because it has an interim person.
Mm-hmm.
And so there it was like, well, let me have lunch, at least someone I know well, and chat with them and get acquainted. And there was part of me that had hoped that I would be tapped for occasional thoughts now and then.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think part of it is when you leave a leadership role, or if you are at a point of your sort of primary career ends, the irony is it ends when you were actually at your most talented, at your most knowledgeable. I've got the most wisdom I've accrued now than I did
Mm-hmm.
5 years, 10 years, 20 years back. And
Mm-hmm.
that wisdom is sort of is not of interest to people, which is an interesting phenomenon. And so that's where I was like, okay, do I want to push for that knowledge to be
Yeah.
shared
Yeah.
or not? And I viewed it as no, I don't. I could sit back and write a book, which is sort of a fun way to sort of get knowledge and thoughts out. But that it really, for my own ego sense like that, that it wasn't healthy for me to sort of, I need to show that I'm still relevant or I have ideas that it's actually
Yeah.
someone else's
Yeah.
period to do that.
I have experienced that in a much more minor way than you, but there is a little bit of pain, in my case at least, involved first, and then a realization like this may well be good for everybody involved. And as you said, I can share my knowledge with those who are interested in different ways. Was that for you at all painful?
Painful. I think the pain is a sense of, there clearly is a sense is my identity is no longer the public person I had.
Yeah.
And that's fine. And but I'd also come to terms a long time ago is my public persona is not my identity entirely. That is not who I am. So I was more interested in the principles behind the public identity. And there, it was good for ego in a sense of how people sort of in their comments leaving and so forth. The comment that I heard the most that was I liked was, Sam listened to me and paid attention to me even though he didn't need to, and that he helped me in a personal way in circumstance X, Y, or Z. And that was interesting because it was that while doing that, that's not something that I thought was the main part of my job, but it's something that I seemed to do and seemed to have been appreciated.
That was
And that was
valued.
that valued, and that I valued of sort of, okay, so this is, the job part is irrelevant, but was I caught up in the power and the dynamics of this, or was I engaging with people, as humans with their challenges? It was nice to hear that validated.
That
And
people
where,
side was very equally important to the power side.
and at least to me. And so that's where I then said, okay, there's a void on this people side. What do I put into that place? And I found that I was doing sort of mentoring, executive coaching of newer executives, but very powerful executives, as something I just thoroughly enjoyed. But I consciously didn't do it with the InterAction community.
Not with the InterAction community. We'll come back to your the activities and the new purposes that you've developed and the new sources of reward, pleasure, etc. since you left. But you wrote to me in an email before we started recording. You said, I'm now enjoying both a different pace and focus. I could imagine what you mean by that, but I'd love to hear it directly from you. What is that different pace and focus?
It is amazing how fast executives are running themselves into the ground. And they're just one item after another. They're just this busyness that you watch people that I kept up for a long time. And when you don't have that need of, I don't have 3 crises for tomorrow, or I don't have to prepare for something like that, there is this removal of sort of the adrenaline of these roles.
Yeah.
And if that's all I lived for, I would have been lost, because all of a sudden there wasn't an adrenaline. But I like the adrenaline, but I also like, going out and you're in the Colorado River and it's a starry night and you're in nature, and there's something about just being human and small and not that big in the grand scheme of things. The awe of what's around you, the beauty of nature, the sense of that. So that
and your mind was probably less. There was no
part
of your mind that was not thinking, okay, but what back home?
You could be more present. you could be uh, sort of slower, more moving from a doing to a being state. Um, uh, what I missed, and I think there's the harder part, was there are some people I spent a lot of time with in my previous role that all of a sudden I wasn't spending time with. And because there was leadership transitions and challenges and so forth, I couldn't spend time with. So you had a sense of loss, not loss of friends, but loss of colleagues and loss of you sort of step back and going, was that just a transaction? They just had me for the role I was in, or were we actually human beings relating to each other? And my sense is we were human beings relating to each other, but there is so much of people tied up in their roles that it makes it difficult. I did go out and go, well, can I convene other groups, and got invited to, to play leadership role. I'm the chair of the advisory council of the, sort of national UN association of the capital area. And there I could convene people. And all of a sudden I'm in a room and I've got people from think tanks and former, assistant secretaries of state and senior people from the UN. And, I could pull some NGO CEOs in the mix. And, you could send something off and it's like, my goodness, the US ambassador to the UN just wrote to me back in an hour. And so you realize that you're still plugged in to some extent. You have a brand that allows you to do this.
Yeah.
But that then start asking the question of like, why what am I doing this for? And is it because I just love convening? And the realization that I actually like the ideas, I like the bantering about and playing with ideas and try to influence things, but that I didn't need the sort of platform of being the convener and spokesperson anymore. So,
and by the way, you live in a city, I don't live there, but in a city, Washington, D.C., that is, of course, I mean, cliche maybe, and simplification for sure, but is populated by a lot of people for whom positional power, prestige, brand, etc., and access to people with power is incredible, important currency, right? So you wouldn't be the first one who would find it all the harder to let go of this professional identity of your past.
I mean, I think yes. So you let go of access and power and so forth. I think it's more the joy of being in a room of people who have good ideas and who banter things about, and are you trying to solve some problem? That what was more motivating than I'm in a room of important people. And I even 10 15 years ago, my comment to my family is I had another one of those silly meetings that I'm sort of in, and okay, by that it's sort of okay, you're with Antonio Guterres, you can start dropping names of the type of people you're in rooms with, spending a day in Geneva in whatever it may be, to realizing they're actually just sort of interesting people and forgetting what their titles are. And that's a real position of privilege to be able to be in a room like that and sort of forget that so-and-so is X and more look at them as the person.
Yeah.
And once that's gone, then it's more, well, those who are less interested in the position of power and who are less interested in being in the important room and so forth, but want to talk about ideas and so forth, those are the people I would like to hang out with.
And you still can, right? And you still
I still can. And so the question is, but it's interesting looking at the work world out there, which I'm not part of, is so many people are so busy positioning themselves in the work world that they miss the fact that it's their relationship with human beings that is actually going to be the lasting thing.
Yeah, and that's now a theme. You've said that a couple of times already in this interview, so that's interesting to me. Now, let's talk for a moment about what you practically do, right? Now, see, because you wrote to me, one can still lead, but in a very different way. So tell us about the activities that you now channel your professional contributions through. You mentioned mentoring.
And what I had planned a year ago or even 6 months ago is not what I'm doing.
Aha. Okay.
You
Tell
know,
us
I sort of,
more.
okay, well, I'll do some boards and I could relatively, assume some leadership roles on boards or globally. Okay, there I used to be with Plan International. I'm now on the US board. I'm starting to engage with the global organization. I'm fascinated in the sort of transfer of power shift with the global South. I've been in different roles in this. Now let's, from a governance perspective, let me sit and look at it from that vantage point. So that was conscious. The idea of writing thoughts and here are some insights gleaned over a 40-year career in the NGO sector. That's sort of a conscious thing to do. What I hadn't thought that I would end up doing was actually having hour-long conversations with new executives or executives in challenges and so forth, very personal one-on-one conversations about the complexities of their job. And the sole purpose is my support of them. That there is no interest in doing their job, no interest in providing the right answer, but the sole purpose is, can I help them feel less alone? Can I give them insights of, I did this 5 or 6 different times, worked 3 out of 4, whatever it was, can I share some insights? But finding value through someone rather than doing oneself.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting, because it's more of a servant role in a sense. Because if it's working, no one knows that you're doing this except for the one person you're talking to. And it's more their feedback of, well, that was meaningful, or that helped me through a difficult circumstance. So there is a desire, I have had a desire to give back sort of all this accrued knowledge, and I want to give back. And I have found, which I had not anticipated, that it was actually the one-on-one giving back in a private setting ended up having more meaning for me than any public giving back or attempts to play public roles after I left InterAction.
Right. Very, very interesting, and makes sense to me. Now, we're going to talk also in a moment about the book, or maybe you wrote 2, maybe even 2 books that you're writing. But before we get that, you did mention also that you sometimes still get called into high-level meetings, not clearly because of your past role with InterAction, but just as Sam the person, and that was a surprise to you. My question then is does that type of presence in that type of meeting with Sam as the individual, right, not as the person with the role, does that ever cause any issues, that a perception that you might not truly want to let go of your old role or the identity that goes with that, or the risk of being perceived as stepping on other people's toes? I'm curious.
So I had thought that once I left and stopped being the president and CEO of InterAction, that access was because I was president and CEO of InterAction. I hadn't anticipated that being in a role for a long time in this small town of Washington, D.C. in the international development field or general field is that you develop a reputation over time and a certain brand and access over time. I presume that that's going to end relatively soon, but I've been surprised that when I've wanted to reach out to someone and say, can you pay attention to me over here? I have something to say. And it's a very senior person, that they actually answer as not, there's no interaction there. It's just Sam has a thought. And so that I found surprising, that there was a carrying of a personal brand.
That carried over.
That I presume is going to less with time as the context shift and so forth.
I would
So there
imagine.
is something about reputational brand that is from a leadership role. Once you leave, it doesn't just turn off; it
Mm,
carries with you.
mm.
The
But the other
yeah,
side of that, yeah,
the other side is so you're stepping on toes and other things like that.
yeah.
The nice thing is you're not worried about the other people's toes. There's no okay if I say something that's a little too edgy for there's no having for years gone, okay, I'm saying something, how is that going to play out politically among hundreds of organizations, and
I
will this
get
get
that.
me in trouble? Now the worst thing that could happen is I don't get asked to talk again. um, but it's more that you're sort of unfiltered in a sense that
Yeah,
the return to the principles is easier because you don't have the political side of caution associated with a political role is gone. So you go back to, well, what do I actually believe in? What is the answer I should be giving here?
yeah, yeah.
The other observation is people are not calling asking for that opinion very often. They're not. The phone stops ringing. That's simple.
It's that simple. Yeah. So that is the other side, though. Yeah. Um, Now, talking about you use the word unfiltered. So you're writing a book or two.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, I'm going to ask you now, what are these one or two books about? Give us a flavor. And then, secondly, I want to ask you, you wrote, my current writing is more candid than a year ago. I'd love for you to tell us more about that. But first, what are you writing about?
And part of it is I say a book or two because it's sort of like I have to decide who my audience is here, and I have slightly two
Mm,
different audiences I'm writing to.
okay.
And whether I combine them in one thing is we'll see, or maybe they're two things. One of them is the more basics. If you are in your mid 30s and you are joining InterAction or you are coming into the NGO sector, over the years, I've observed that people would come into the sector and have their master's degree in international development policy, whatever their degree is in, and
Mm-hmm.
they know a slice of the sector very well. Their understanding of the big picture is very limited. And one of the real privileges I had was since I sort of sat in a role where I could see what dozens and dozens of executives were doing across different types of organizations and purpose and mission, that you get a much broader understanding of what the US international NGO sector is than if you're
Mm-hmm.
sitting in one organization. So
Of course.
there are insights in that role that I thought would be useful to share if someone come in. If you want to understand the NGO sector, it's more complex and more diverse than you are, with its flaws and its strengths. I do have a bias, and the bias reflects my past, is for all the flaws these organizations have, they actually have a really relevant role in the world.
A necessary role,
And
as you've said.
what is that necessary role? Where should they go? So forth. So that's one story.
What? May I ask you a quick follow-up question on that,
Sure.
Sam? This is maybe actually more a pitch, to be truthful. I hope you will also, in that providing through this book, the understanding of the whole sector, also maybe shine your valuable light on how you think that the US NGO sector is perceived by others in the world, right? You and I have sometimes compared
Right.
notes on that, and how so both sides, how the US sector perceives other INGOs of a global north founded nature, particularly, and vice versa. That's just my pitch. You don't have to, of course, but I could help myself.
I mean, I've been careful of, okay, here I am, a white male, privileged, global north, US passport, ability to bounce in and out of different countries. Okay, yes, I've been to multiple war zones, but it's I'm coming from a position of significant influence. So one thing I've made sure I didn't want to do, make sure I didn't do it, is I'm speaking from where I've come from. I can't
Mm-hmm.
say what others want in that mix. So it's not a counter to your pitch, but it is sort of, I am speaking where at least from my vantage point. That said, the bulk of what you want to call it critique or or sort of analysis is what is local? What is this all about? Who is the agent of change here? Who are the heroes involved in a change process? And so that sense of it's not about you, Northern NGOs. You're just one part of this. And so how do you contribute? And by the way, these types of funding are fundamentally at odds with the stated values of local power, which in some ways US government money is, for all the goals stated. One of the primary concerns of US government is make sure taxpayer dollars are well spent. Well, that's a different goal than I am accompanying you in your change process. So in that sense, I could be more blunt in that sense of localization from Sam's perspective, both in a critique of localization, but also a critique of, well, what is it you're actually trying to get towards in that process?
Yeah, I was actually more thinking in my question, I probably wasn't clear. I was, for instance, how do European NGOs see American NGOs or other global North founded NGOs? How do they see the stance and the behaviors of US NGOs and vice versa? That was more the angle of my
the Europe US, and as someone who grew up in Europe, I could see that.
Exactly.
And I haven't gone there, but I could go there. I think it's useful to go to because we're all products of our culture and where we come from, and there's a certain American hubris of we're the center without playing in the broader, engage with the rest of the world. And
and so without going into this in this interview, I am primarily saying I think that would be also very valuable for you to shine your light on that. Now, back to you said you had a second audience.
Well, the second audience, and this is whether it's a separate book or so forth, and the working title used for this part is sort of A Prisoner of Hope. And it mirrors some of my last comments to the CEO group when I left. I come out of this as someone who remains optimistic and hopeful about humanity's future. And so how do you do that at a time when, people are fighting over hospitals in Gaza, and I've been in Gaza, and how do you do this at a time when you know what climate change is doing to the world and so forth? And where I've come out is sort of stories I've collected over the years is no matter how tough the environment, no matter how difficult the circumstances, there are always local individuals who have chosen and taken upon themselves to do what they can to improve the circumstances of their neighbors and their world around them. So there's always someone whose circumstances are much, much more complicated and difficult than ours, who are not complaining about how bad the world is and if, why isn't, the traffic behaving the way it should be doing, or whatever it is that people complain about, who are actually in very difficult circumstances, who spend their lives trying to improve the lives of others. And these people are not heroes. They're just normal human beings. I call them local heroes, but they're just normal human beings who have made a choice of improving human well-being is something I value. And that is replicated all over the world, times millions and millions of individuals. And our media doesn't cover that. Our media covers when something breaks or is wrong, or this. It doesn't cover the sense of that we as humanity have decided to uplift ourselves, and that within that mix is not just a family doing it, but that there are individuals who've chosen to do it for their neighbors or their broader community. And it is a broader sort of civil society creation, this idea that I imagine the world to be a better place. And what I wanted to affirm is I'm still convinced of that. And I'm still in awe of what people do. And we, in the NGO world would go, someone went on a field visit, quote unquote, and came back. You went to a very difficult place. You were in Darfur or wherever it was, and you came back sort of amazed. Not You see the horror, you see the bad things, but they're actually individuals doing some powerfully positive things. And I think that's a story we all need to hear and remind ourselves a bit.
Yeah. And that is a reason for hope, you're saying. Yeah.
There is a reason for hope.
And you said your current writing is more candid than a year ago. What's that about?
Part of it is I poke at some foundations. I poke at the power of money in a way that I didn't before. There's a certain rhetoric around we're going to do things, and the answer is I am. I wouldn't say disturbed. I've always been aware of it, but the system, there is no such thing as money without the use of power. That someone.
You mean it's not possible to have those types of and volumes of money without power? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So either it's your own money or your own generated resources, but I believe in an interconnected world. So what is that? Let's be open. Rather than say it should go away or the world should be somehow, let's shift the power and have no power associated with money. Well, that's naive in the sense that there is always going to be something associated with the money. So the question is, what is that? Where is do I want these resources? Do they make sense? And there are types of resources that have more strings associated than others. And the more formal the resources, the greater the strings.
Got it. So that's what you also want to write about. So looking at the time as we start to slowly bring this interview to a close, I just want to quote you something from a book that you and I have both read by Arthur Brooks, another American author, and he's written a book called From Strength to Strength. And I want to quote this part. He says, many of us assume that the more successful we are, the less susceptible we become to the sense of professional and social irrelevance that often accompanies aging. But the truth is, he says, the greater our achievements and our attachment to them, the more we notice our decline and the more painful it is when it occurs. So what can we do now, he says, to make our older years a time of happiness, purpose, and yes, success? So we have talked about a couple of dimensions of this as we bring this interview to a close. How do you reflect upon that?
Undeniably, there's a sense of loss, of a letting go. At the same time, it's been quite a while since I realized that, there's some 30-something who's smarter than I am, who's more able to do things faster and quicker. But as one gets older, it's the connections that one makes, the sort of seeing the interlinking of ideas, the wisdom, the knowledge accrued. And so by shifting towards the sharing of that knowledge, that sharing of that wisdom does give deep meaning. It's just a different form of meaning than I have a role, I have a title, or I'm, able to dazzle a room, which is I can't. But what one can do is make connections and see context and the relevance of and the irrelevance of things to worry about that make life for someone who's in that fast lane a bit easier. So that's where I see my spending some of this interim period. And we'll see how long it will be, because it is awfully tempting to spend some time looking at a mountain or walking up a hill.
And you most definitely need to do that. Yeah. And that makes me think that what you just said is related to what Arthur Brooks talks about, this synthesizing of knowledge, right? That people in the second part of their lives are particularly, that is one of our strengths. So Sam, thank you so much for being so not just reflective. I've always known you to be reflective, and I've always valued that about you. But you've also been pretty honest, pretty candid about your inner state of mind, if you will, as you go through this transition into a next phase in life. Some people start calling it a third career or a fourth career or whatever, but I'm just going to call it the next phase in life and in state of being. So thanks for that. Where should people go if they want to learn more about you?
Well, you could find me on LinkedIn at Sam Worthington, and sort of tied with InterAction. And perhaps that's the easiest way to get hold of me is through my LinkedIn address.
And you are pretty active there, and people pay attention to what you're doing. So that's a good place to go. Thank you, Sam, for all your insights, as I said, and thank you, listeners. If you found this podcast episode stimulating, then be sure to check out some of the other episodes of my podcast. There are some that do focus, just like this one, on how we should lead ourselves, our internal states of minds, if you will, such as episode 41 with Chris Prue at Umentum, where we discussed sabbaticals and what they do to our state of mind as a leader. You can find these episodes and more, not just on my website, 5oaksconsulting.org, that is with the number 5, but also on my YouTube channel. Subscribe to my email list, and you will always be the first to be in the know. And with that, this is Tosca, and I look forward to spending time with you next time on NGO Soul and Strategy.